Welcome to today's lecture, Reading and Writing as Performance. Before watching this lecture, make sure that you have already watched the teaching sample videos featured 赵老师 and Noda Sensei, no matter what language you teach. Don't worry if you cannot fully comprehend what's going on in those videos. I'm sure with the training you have received so far, you can still catch a lot from them, so make sure you have watched all of them. While you watch those videos, please consider how the context is established for reading and writing. What techniques does the instructor use? And following each contextualization, what kind of reading and writing performances do learners engage in? What else do they do in addition to reading and writing performances? And one thing you may have noticed that is some reading and writing activities are well connected to each other to develop a coherent story so that learners can easily compile them into their memory. We will discuss more about this in our next PLec video when we talk about how to shift between contexts to build a full hour of well-connected activities. But you can start thinking about those questions while watching this week's teaching samples, especially that relatively longer Chinese teaching video, which is a good example. And today's lecture has three components. In the first part, I'm going to address some basic assumptions about reading and writing. People who are new to perform culture approach often misunderstood it as an approach that can only be applied to listening and speaking class, featuring dialogue performance. It's important to know that reading and writing are also contextualized performances that prompt communication. So in the second part, we will revisit those teaching samples and have a detailed analysis of those reading-writing performances that students have engaged in. In the last section, I will give you assignments to prepare you for this week's practicum session. Okay, let's start. Let's start with an overview of some keywords that you will hear a lot in this lecture. Some of them are likely familiar to you because they are all covered in our previous lectures. However, today we will revisit them in the context of reading and writing instruction. As I said, PCA is sometimes wrongly assumed as an approach only for teaching listening and speaking. The reason is associated with traditional perception that speaking and writing are active skills, while reading and listening are passive skills. However, if we take into consideration about the mental activity required for listening and reading comprehension, we realize that both require mental processing, active mental processing involving knowledge and skills. Let's review the definition of performance. Think about the reading activities you have seen from those teaching sample videos. Are they performances? Did they take place in specified occasions? That's time plus place. And what's the purpose of those reading activities? The purpose of reading is usually related to the roles involved, isn't it? You read some lecture handout as a student, and you read online reviews as a customer before you try out a product or service. Speaking of audience, the audience might not be present, but when you read your lecture handout, some of us may in your mind, you may think about what questions professors will ask me. And when you write, your message certainly has an intended audience. Now let's take a look at the two reading activities from the teaching samples. In the Chinese class, the students are standing in front of a bulletin board on campus. One is a native speaker of Chinese, while the other is an international student who can speak Chinese, but is not able to read. The script is the movie poster. In the Japanese class, Sasha Morris, an intern working at a Japanese company, is reading a post-it note from a colleague she previously talked to about some stationery she wants to order. So with these two examples, it is not hard for us to agree reading and writing are also socially motivated activities. There are social motivated activities because first, language itself is social. Words mean what they mean because of how they are used in society. Their uses and meanings change based on social contexts. And we read and write in a social context. The culture of our society defines our acts of reading and writing in terms of where, when, why, and how certain texts are generally read or written. As members of the literate world, we are socialized to read and write. We grow up experiencing how texts are used in society. They develop an awareness of the relationship between reading and writing and participation in societal events and experiences. We also react what we read, and reading can spur conversations or lead to writing activities. Readers use their personal experiences to relate to the text. So as Warnick pointed out here, readers are contributing something original rather than merely handling or processing what is read. Since now we have talked about what reading and writing are, now let's take a look what they are not. Unfortunately, those activities I'm going to talk about on this not list can still be observable from many foreign language classes today. First, reading is not decoding. Decode is to convert a coded message into intelligible language. And in this context, it is to map the written symbols onto the sound and then convert it to one's base language. If you have your students engage in some premature reading activities, these activities will inevitably become bilingual decoding, in which reading fluency is missing. Second, reading does not equal reading aloud. Most reading in our life takes place silently. Actually, oral reading is processed in the mind very differently than silent reading. It is common to see when you have a learner read aloud something and then ask a question to check their understanding, it's very likely that he or she still need to look at the text again silently. And third, reading is not translating. Being able to comprehend a text and act upon it does not necessarily mean you can translate it into your native language. Vice versa, being able to translate the text into your base language does not always promise success in demonstrating your understanding in conversation. However, we have always found that learners are asked to read aloud and then discuss the content of what was read, often in English, because their teachers tend to believe this is the quickest way to check to what extent the learners have understood what they have read in the text. Well, the problem with reading aloud and the translation is that neither of them is a culturally authentic process. They do not provide useful practices to build reading strategies that are beneficial for long-term skill development. In another word, they do not help learners compile useful cultural memory around the text. At this point, I believe some of you may say, well, I think I did see some oral reading or even translation in those teaching samples, right? You're right. Things like oral reading, it has its pedagogical use. When implemented efficiently, it can work as an effective and quick check about students' knowledge of the pronunciation of orthography. And you may recall that in the Japanese video with 2 students in a relatively lower level class, the instructor asked students to read something in a manga speech bubbles. And at that stage, students have only learned a very limited number of kana. The purpose of that activity is more of an exercise to build students' automaticity and confidence in processing those kanas by mapping the graph to the sound. As soon as students sounded it out, they immediately understand the meaning of it because the content of that conversation was learned way before in their speaking class. But you may also recall that in another video taking place at a higher level, when the students were asked to read a message on a post-it note, she tended to read it aloud, as this is our default action for reading in a foreign language class. However, the instructor immediately stopped her, indicating that she should read silently. These 2 activities have very different pedagogical purposes, which of course correspond to the learner's levels. Similarly, you may also remember the Chinese instructor asked students to translate the title of the movie in content questions. The movie title is a new combination of the characters students have learned. By the way, I think those movie titles are brilliant, don't you think so? With that limited number of characters students have been exposed to, these creative combinations are not only interesting, but also more importantly, realistic. So for those movie titles, there is no other way to check students' comprehension other than having them translate those titles, because if at a higher level, they may be able to develop some extended conversation about the title by predicting the story of the movie, for example. However, at the beginner level, they do not have the language yet to handle that kind of task. Also, sometimes have your students translate certain expressions also help other students who are still struggling with the orthography and who have lost track of what's going on in class. However, oral reading itself is not reading. Translation itself is not reading. That means they should not take up the majority of a reading class and must be followed by authentic, task-based cultural performances. In order to successfully participate in those reading-writing activities, orthography development is also necessary. Some common pedagogical practices for orthography development include acquiring knowledge of radicals or recognizing and producing characters at the word, sentence, or sometimes paragraph level. Unfortunately, some scholars and instructors still tend to associate decoding and vocabulary with lower level instruction and the true reading writing activities with intermediate or advanced level. Under such assumption, the so-called reading writing class exclusively consists of orthography development and never go beyond that. You may wonder, why does it happen? That's because mastering written symbol is a major focus throughout the educational path of a native speaker of Chinese or Japanese in our 国語 or 国文语文课. So when native speakers of Chinese or Japanese become the instructor teaching the language to non-native speaker, their understanding about what reading writing is as a native speaker make them equate learning to read or write with learning to process or produce characters. They even think the instruction of orthography should precede teaching speaking because of its linguistic superiority of literate speakers in Chinese and Japanese society. And the ability to read will enrich one's language. These thoughts are called native assumption and are summarized in NODA 2003. These native assumptions affect how reading and writing are taught because teaching of reading is often modeled after the teacher's own experience of learning to read in their native language. Next, let's talk about primacy of speech. This is the pedagogical decision we make under PCA when it comes to reading and writing instruction. It is also against some of the native assumptions about reading and writing, as I just reviewed. First, primacy of speech proposes using pedagogical transcription, that is pinyin for Chinese and romanization for Japanese, to visually represent the form of the language as a reminder of the sound. With the help of pedagogical transcript, we're able to have the instruction in spoken language precede reading and writing activities and purposefully delay the introduction of writing system. So that when the writing system is introduced, students have already developed a sound meaning connection to which they can map the graph component. I want to stress that the pedagogical transcription is intended only as a reminder of pronunciation. Therefore, it is inappropriate for learning or teaching pronunciation and intonation by reading those transcripts. Instead, audio input is always the primary material we work with. The role of pedagogical transcription is to support the audio media, not the other way around. There are several reasons to explain why we want to delay the introduction of written language. First, we want to follow the order of natural language acquisition, how we acquire our native language. And second, learners can learn both the spoken language and the written language more effectively and efficiently if they are not forced to deal with the entire range of issues simultaneously. Using the native script as the means of presenting information in the early development of conversational skills just add unnecessary burden that can complicate and slow the learning process. 3, we want to provide an opportunity for learners to review those previously learned contents, and the reading writing session provides such opportunity. Now let's go back to the 2 reading performances we previously analyzed. Are these performances? Yes, we already answered that question. But are these performances authentic? Well, to evaluate the authenticity of these activities, let's revisit the definition of authenticity under PCA. Authenticity refers to the use of language that would create a story that is contextually and culturally feasible. In the context of a reading-writing activity, we need to attend to more aspects to assess its authenticity. First, the orthography authenticity. Orthography authenticity relates to the manner in which the writing system is used. A bad example of orthographic authenticity is like using simplified character menu in a Taiwanese restaurant, or you use hiragana for a restaurant menu. The second aspect is task authenticity. Is the task something learners are most likely to encounter in real life? Teachers realize using realia is an excellent way to expose learners to natural texts, but they often overlook that tasks should also be based on the kinds of interactions native readers have with those texts. In another word, if you have your students read a menu, then you should have them order after reading, instead of just translate the menu or you ask students what's in the menu while you're looking at the same menu. The third aspect is the medium authenticity. That means the medium in which the text is presented. If you ask students to produce a postcard, it needs to be handwritten. Similarly, if it is a photo caption for something posted on the social media, then it needs to be typed. In the second video of Japanese class you have seen, Shirai-san left a message to Sasha Morris, and the message is written down on a post-it note. If you watch carefully, you will see that the instructor intentionally choose a font that looks like handwriting, right? And all these details show the effort that the instructor has put to ensure the authenticity, especially the medium authenticity we're talking about here. The last one is story authenticity. How is the story presented? Is it similar to how things are normally done in real life? Does this course of activities in the given task resemble the scripts shared among native speakers? Those are the questions you want to ask yourself. Based on these standards, we can confidently say that the script in the previous performances are very authentic. Actually, the first text, the movie poster, is a realia. It is the Chinese version of the Japanese movie Kimi no Na wa. But don't equate the authenticity with using realia. Blind use of realia can backfire. Classroom tasks are at best simulations, but we can make them look like real-life tasks. When we stress authenticity, it also does not mean that the whole class 50 minutes can only consist of authentic performances. Sometimes we need to sacrifice authenticity to provide pedagogical support to our learners, especially during the initial learning sequence. We actually have observed a lot of examples of this kind of pedagogical support in all the videos we have watched, and we call them scaffolding. Why do we need scaffolding in real life? Yes, to build solid structure, a building, a sculpture, right? But why do we need scaffolding in foreign language learning? To build solid performance, to build successful performance. The purpose of the scaffolding activity is to prepare learners for the authentic performances they will engage in later on. It helps learners do things they cannot do on their own. And gradually, the supports are removed as learners can do things on their own. Therefore, the scaffolding activities are not the end goal. The last concept I want to touch upon before we take a break is automaticity. Automaticity is a crucial skill for reading. It is the ability to process a stretch of language effortlessly, quickly, and accurately, rather than as isolated characters or words. All the activities you have seen from that lower level reading session in Japanese are practices to foster students' lower level processing skills, to strengthen the graph-sound connection. The greater the automaticity in processing meaningful units of a text, the more attention can be given to high-level cognitive processing, which is also very important in reading. Okay, now let's take a break, do some stretching, and we will come back.